Hi, William here again. Welcome back again to the fourth session with Paul Howard's fluting jig. Now, continuing on the theme of getting to know the equipment and some basics, today I'm going to optimistically move forward and attempt some lattice work. So, what is lattice work? We've all seen pictures on Facebook and Pinterest of these wonderful bowls and platters that have this lattice work and often wondered how they did it. Now, I've looked quite extensively through YouTube and other online medias, and also through my extensive collection of Woodturner magazine, and no one's giving too much away. So lattice work then is when there are annular and lateral cuts in a piece which intersect and at least one breaking through the other to reveal daylight through the gaps. So we can see here I've just drawn on this sycamore blank some arcs, some annular and the thinner ones in red, which were lateral cuts. Now, from the limited information I have managed to glean, it will seem, or at least appear to seem, as though the annular cuts are not in fact done by a router. They are in fact done by hand using a parting tool. And it would appear that only the lateral cuts are in fact done using the router. Now, I've inquired with one or two people I know who have a lot more experience with the router than I do as to why the annular cuts cannot be made with the router. The common reason that I've been given is because of the change in orientation of the grain from going to side grain to end grain would result in some significant tear out. Now, I can accept that advice at face value because it comes from people with far more experience than I. But I do want to see for myself what the issues are with using the router with the lathe moving to make an annular groove. So I'm going to have a go at that before I get underway with this piece today. So my task today is to attempt to make a lattice work platter with this 10-inch by 1.5-inch piece of sycamore. Now, as I just mentioned before, the lattice work effect is actually caused by breaking through with either the parting tool or the router bit through to the work on the other side of the piece, creating air gaps between them to give the lattice effect. Now, at this stage I'm not even sure which type of router bit I should be using, so actually I'm just going for a 6mm square-ended bit, simply because it's the nearest I have to my 5mm parting tool. So I fitted the 6mm cutter into the router. I had decided that the thickness of the platter should be around 6mm, it's quite thin, and therefore I've set the depth of the router cutter at 4mm, which gives a 1mm breakthrough. So first task then will be to true up the face of the platter, and then we'll try our little experiment with the router bit and the blank moving. Okay, so here I've mounted my improvised rotor base on the lathe. I've mounted the router jig and I've centered the router cutter center to the piece. Okay, I've got the lathe turning at about 600 RPM and the router is on, and now let's see what happens. Okay, there's some resistance to the cutter. I'm guessing it's because the cutter is not meant to cut in this orientation. There's a little bit of vibration, but nothing to be concerned about. Okay then, as soon as we stop the lathe we can see that there is some significant tear out there, far beyond what could be repaired by something like abrasive. So before I rough out the platter, just using some of the wood here to practice some cuts using a 5mm parting tool. It doesn't seem to be much of a challenge to get nice even 4mm depth cuts with a nice sharp tool. And also, of course, you can mark the depth of cut on your parting tool using something like a Sharpie. Okay, here then just turning off my training work and roughing out the shape of the platter. And then on to making a recess for the O'Donnell jaws, and very, very optimistically a recess for my logo. Just a bit of abrasive work down through the grits from 180 to 240. Okay, just marking out here the rear of the platter. I have 7 centimeters to play with, which gives me conveniently 7 iterations of the 5mm annular rings. Okay then, just now cutting the annular grooves down to 4mm. Now just cleaning up the grooves using a bit of 240 abrasive paper. Okay, just now reversing the piece onto the O'Donnell jaws, which gives that little bit of extra clearance. And then on to face off the front of the platter. Now abrading down through the grits down to 400. Quick thickness check, down to about 5.5mm. Okay, so now time to mount my improvised router base. Now I need to control the lateral movement of the router so that it doesn't intrude too far into the center of the piece. And I can achieve this by screwing the batten to the base in the appropriate place. Okay then, so having done all the necessary safety checks, time to give this a whirl. Okay, that looks good, just not quite deep enough. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put another 0.5 millimeter or so depth on the router cutter and just go over it again. Okay then, so after the second pass, it's cleaned all the material away nicely, but as you can see, the contour of the bowl at the back is different from it is at the front, so that needs to be addressed before I go any further. Okay, so off camera I've tried to make the contour at the face of the platter the same as the rear in order to overcome this problem with the depth of cut. You'll see a bit later on that this did not resolve the problem, in fact it added to the problem. Okay, I've altered the profile of the face slightly and increased the depth of cut. The problem that I do have is that I tried to correct the depth of cut on the inner annular ring by increasing the depth of cut for the last inch or so on the front of the platter. In doing this, I kind of messed it up to the point where I don't believe I can easily recover from it. So as a reminder not to do this again, I completed the additional cut for half of the platter and left the other half untouched. Okay, I'm going to carry on and finish this piece regardless. So now I must turn out the centre of the platter. Currently I'm inclined to think that this piece is gagging for some colour. I really hate sandpaper and abrasive work. I'm going to have to find some way to speed this process up before I fall asleep. Now, the best solution I can come up with for the present is a sliver of wood slightly thinner than the grooving with some sandpaper wrapped around it to clean out the grooves. It seems to be working okay. Now, this piece of sycamore is a very nice piece of wood to work with, but it contains no interesting grain or any features, so I'm going to give it a good dosing of green spirit stain and then sand it back to see what it looks like. Okay, I've given it a generous dose of green stain. I'll let it dry now, see what it turns out like. Okay, so off camera I've just tried various ways of embellishing the surface of the piece. I've tried some silver and some gold gilt, not to particularly good effect, and I've settled on Martin Sabin-Smith's gold wax, which used sparingly gives it a kind of a random gold sheen, which is a nice effect. Just giving it a couple of minutes to dry and then a bit of a buff up with a paper towel. And just cleaning up the centre here to get rid of all of the green stain and my test patches. Okay, so I've sanded the centre back to 400, given the whole piece a good blowout with an airline, and putting 2 coats of sanding sealer on. I want to accentuate the transition between the green part of the platter and the centre portion by adding some gold gilt to the rim with the aid of a cotton bud. Having added the gold gilt, I can't say I'm very happy with the outcome, so I'm going to go grab a thirsty ferret, sleep on it and think about it tomorrow. So in the cold light of the morning I decided to add a bit of texture to the rim with some black stain and infill it with the gold embellishing wax. Okay, just cleaning up the centre feature here. I think this is about the 3rd time. Okay, just working in some Hampshire Sheen gold embellishing wax into the texturing that we just did with the Dremel. Okay, that's had a couple of minutes to dry, and I'll just get rid of the surplus wax and buff it up using a bit of kitchen towel. Okay, so there we have it. A far from perfect example of some lattice work, but for me personally an extremely useful lesson. So what lessons did I draw from this project? Firstly, the obvious one, of course, because the fluting didn't work as intended, that the thickness of the piece where you're going to do the fluting must be uniform. If it isn't, even millimetres can make a difference between the fluting breaking through partially, fully or too far. Secondly, abrasive work involving lattice work is quite detailed and very long-winded. I've seen and heard reports of people who do this saying that they spend one or more days sanding the intricate parts of this work. Well, I have to say personally, spending a whole day sanding is not for me, and therefore I need to identify ways of speeding this up. And I guess the third point that I draw from this is that planning your piece is absolutely essential, and I think that's what I'm going to dedicate my next video regarding Paul Howard's fluting jig is on the planning process. Well, thanks very much for joining me on this my fourth outing with the fluting jig. I was going to skip next week because of Yandel's show, but since that's been cancelled, now I can turn my attention back to my next project with the jig.